During the First World War, former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt was a hardcore advocate for the U.S. entering the war. In March 1917, Congress gave Roosevelt the authority to raise a maximum of 4 divisions similar to the Rough Riders, and Major Frederick Russell Burnham was put in charge of both the general organization and recruitment. However, President Woodrow Wilson announced to the press that he would not send Roosevelt and his volunteers to France, but instead an American expeditionary force under the command of General John J. Pershing when the U.S. declared war on Germany. Theodore Roosevelt also requested to President Wilson that he be able to take a volunteer unit into France in May of 1917. His volunteers' plan included a few big-name government officials who were also veterans and generals to become his officers, and Roosevelt didn't tell Wilson that he also planned on raising at least 1 regiment of African-American troops, and he also never told Wilson that he wanted one of his officers to be African-American, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young, who he planned on promoting to Brigadier General. Anyway, Wilson rejected the idea and the whole unit's creation and the deployment to France. Roosevelt would then make one last-ditch attempt to command a volunteer unit on the Western Front, where he offered to General John J. Pershing to raise volunteers and have his sons in the unit as privates. He also already had one daughter who was in France as a nurse since before American entry into the war. Pershing agreed to this, however, President Woodrow Wilson declined, and this would be the last of Roosevelt's attempts to make a volunteer force and fight in World War I. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was previously an officer in the United States Army before American entry into World War I, but soon after the First World War had started, Ted was called up from the reserves. When the United States declared war on the German Empire, he volunteered to be one of the first soldiers to go to the Western Front. There he was recognized as the best battalion commander in his division, according to the division commander. Roosevelt was brave under gunfire and gas as he led his battalion into combat. He was so concerned for his men's welfare that he purchased combat boots for the entire battalion with his own money, and Ted eventually commanded the 26th Regiment in the 1st Division as a lieutenant colonel. He fought in several major battles, including America's first victory at the Battle of Cantigny, where he was wounded in action. Ted was gassed by the Germans at the Battle of Soissons during the summer of 1918. He also participated in the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and in the defensive sector. Ted received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the war, and the French conferred on him the Chevalier Légion d'Honneur on March 16, 1919. Before the troops came home from France, Ted was one of the founders of what became the American Legion. During World War II, Ted returned to the Army as a brigadier general and was well known for often being on the front lines, as he preferred being in a battle to being in a command post. Roosevelt led the 26th Infantry in an attack on Oran, Algeria on November 8, 1942 as part of Operation Torch during the Allied invasion of North Africa. In 1943, he was cited for the French Croix de Guerre by French General Alphonse Juin for showing courage in the face of the Axis as a general under fire who disregarded his own personal danger. In Sicily, however, Roosevelt faced several challenges. He was friends with his CEO, Major General Terry Allen, who was an unorthodox general and who Patton viewed as very competent. However, Patton strongly disliked Allen's cavalier attitude and how both he and Roosevelt dressed like common soldiers. Roosevelt was considered to be guilty by association with Allen, and both would be relieved. However, Patton would note that he saw Roosevelt as a very brave man despite his relief. General Bradley then relieved the pair for being too close to their men in their divisions and claimed that their divisions had poor discipline and said that it was one of the worst things that he had to do. After being relieved, Roosevelt commanded Allied forces in Sardinia and fought on the Italian mainland. He was the chief liaison officer to the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy for General Eisenhower and repeatedly made requests for Eisenhower for a combat command. Ike then assigned Ted to England in February of 1944 to help lead the 4th Infantry for the Normandy landings, where he consistently would request to go ashore on D-Day, and he was eventually approved to go ashore. Ted Roosevelt was the only general on D-Day to land by sea with the first wave of troops on Utah Beach and was one of the first men off of his landing craft. At age 56, he was the oldest man in the D-Day invasion, and the only man whose son also landed that day, as Captain Quentin Roosevelt II was among the first wave of soldiers on Omaha Beach. However, Ted's division landed a mile off course, and he dismissed plans to move to their assigned landing area and ordered all reinforcements and support to come to them, stating that they were going to be starting the war from right there. Roosevelt's impromptu plans worked out with complete success and little confusion. With artillery landing close by, each follow-on regiment was personally welcomed on the beach by the calm, cool, and collected General Roosevelt, who inspired all of his men with humor, confidence, poetry, and anecdotes of his father to steady their nerves. Roosevelt pointed almost every regiment to its newly changed objective points. Sometimes he worked under fire as a self-appointed traffic cop, untangling traffic jams of trucks and tanks, and struggling to get inland off the beach. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. would die of a heart attack in France on July 12, 1944, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on D-Day. Before his time in the military, Kermit Roosevelt saved his father's life in a Brazilian jungle in 1913 when Theodore Roosevelt contracted malaria and a very serious infection resulting from a minor leg wound. His dad considered killing himself to be less of a burden on the group, but Kermit told him that he was bringing him back literally dead or alive, and if he died, then he would be even more of a burden to the expedition. Although Kermit also contracted malaria, he downplayed his sickness to save quinine for Theodore Roosevelt, and nearly died himself before the physician insisted that he give himself medical injections. Kermit Roosevelt's determination and his rope and canoe handling skills were instrumental in saving his father's life. Kermit had been in the U.S. Army before American entry into World War I, but resigned his commission and joined the British Army in 1917 to fight in the Mesopotamia theater of World War I, which is in modern-day Iraq. He was attached to the 14th Light Armored Motor Battalion of Machine Gun Corps, but the British High Command decided that they could not risk his life, so they made him an officer in charge of transport. Within months of being posted to Mesopotamia, he mastered spoken as well as written Arabic and was often relied upon as a translator with the locals by the British. He was awarded the Military Cross by the British for actions in Mesopotamia, but decided to transfer back to the U.S. Army and went to the American Expeditionary Force in France. Roosevelt was commissioned as a captain in the U.S. Army on May 12, 1918, and commanded the Sea Battery Artillery Company of the 7th Battalion of the 1st Division, and he participated in the Meuse-Argonne offensive near the end of the war. With World War II breaking out in 1939, Kermit rejoined the British Army in October with the help of Winston Churchill. His first task was to lead a contingent of British volunteers for the Winter War in Finland. However, before the expedition could be launched, Finland made peace with Russia. Roosevelt's next action was in Norway, where he served with distinction in conducting a raid against the Germans and was wounded at the Battle of Narvik. Kermit would also participate in the North Africa campaign until 1941, when he was medically discharged from the British Army. Roosevelt appealed this discharge all the way up to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who upheld the medical discharge as Kermit was debilitated by an enlarged liver complicated by a resurgence of malaria. Upon his return to the United States, he battled depression and a drinking problem, and to extract him from his situation, President FDR commissioned him as a major in the U.S. Army, sent him to Alaska as an intelligence officer to help set up Alaskan Native militias. Kermit would tragically take his own life on June 4, 1943 due to depression. Archibald Roosevelt volunteered for the U.S. Army during 1917 and was shipped over to France and was wounded while serving in the U.S. 1st Infantry Division when he was hit in the knee. His wounds were so severe that his discharge from the U.S. Army saw him receive full disability pay, and he also ended the war as an Army captain. For his valor, Archie received 2 Silver Stars and the French government's Croix de Guerre. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Archie Roosevelt petitioned President FDR to put his battlefield-owned leadership skills to worthwhile use supporting the war effort. The President approved his request and he rejoined the U.S. Army as a major. Archie was given command in early 1943 of the U.S. Army's 3rd Battalion of the 162nd Regiment in New Guinea. Working with the Australian 3rd Division, Roosevelt led his battalion when they landed in New Guinea's Nassau Bay on July 8th. Archie Roosevelt played an important role in the Salamaua campaign, which lasted from April until September of 1943. His service was recognized as one of the hotly contested ridgelines northwest of the island's Tambu Bay and was nicknamed Roosevelt's Ridge, as the Battle of Roosevelt's Ridge lasted from July 21st to August 14th, which saw fierce fighting and artillery barrages on all sides. On August 12, 1943, Roosevelt was wounded by an enemy grenade which shattered the same knee that had been injured in World War I, and for which he had been earlier received a medical discharge and retirement, earning him the distinction to be the only American to have ever been classified as 100% disabled twice, for the same wound occurred in 2 different wars. Archie returned to his unit in early 1944, when he was then finally discharged. For actions in the Pacific Theater of Operations, Roosevelt was awarded another 2 Silver Stars. Quentin Roosevelt was the youngest of the Roosevelt kids with the outbreak of the First World War, and he believed his mechanical skills could be better utilized in the 1st Reserve Aero Squadron. Upon being sent to France, Lieutenant Roosevelt first helped in setting up the large air service training base at Issoudun. He was a supply officer and then, in time, ran to be one of the training airfield pilots. Eventually, he became a pilot in the 95th Aero Squadron, being part of the 1st Pursuit Group. Roosevelt had one confirmed kill of a German aircraft during the German Spring Offensive, which he was shot down on July 10, 1918. 4 days later, in a massive aerial engagement in the commencement of the Second Battle of the Marne, Roosevelt himself was shot down behind German lines. Quentin Roosevelt was killed by 2 machine gun bullets which struck him in the head. The Germans buried him with full battlefield honors, and since the plane had crashed so near to the front lines, they used 2 pieces of the basswood saplings bound together with wire to fashion a cross for his grave. For propaganda purposes, the Germans made a postcard of the dead pilot and his plane. However, this was met with shock in Germany, which still held Theodore Roosevelt in very high regard and respect, and they were impressed that a former president's son had died on active duty. The French government posthumously awarded Quentin Roosevelt the Croix de Guerre with palm, and his death shook Theodore Roosevelt so much that he never recovered from his son's death, and the former president would die 6 months later. Last and not least is Ethel Roosevelt, who was a nurse in World War I and served in France in the American Ambulance Hospital and worked in the same hospital where her husband was a battlefield surgeon in. She was the first of Theodore Roosevelt's kids to serve in World War I, as she had been in France since before American entry into the war. And after the war, Ethel served in the Red Cross for the next 60 years. Did you know about Theodore Roosevelt and his kids during the World Wars? Would you like a separate video on each one of them, as this video has just pretty much been a brief summary about all of them? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.